Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Freelance Monocle. In this episode, we chat with 3D artist Nathanael Fairbotham. We learned about his career and how he started his path into 3D through an unconventional way that isn't very common and really cool to hear. This one's a special episode since Nate was kind enough to give us a video walkthrough and project breakdown into one of his actual client projects. This was another fun chat, so let's go check it out. Hey, Nate, man, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. Doing not too bad. How's everything going with you?
Good. It's been a bit of a busy week, but it's been good. So I'm enjoying the weekend.
Nice. Well, we appreciate you making the time, man. I know you're busy, but I'm glad we got our schedules aligned. But I think we have some awesome stuff to talk about. So thanks again for being here.
Happy to be on.
Awesome. So just to kick off the conversation, can you quickly introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah. My name is Nathanael Fairbotham. I am a full-time 3D artist, mainly a Blender artist. I use Cinema 4D, but Blender is kind of the main package that I use. I guess a little bit of a background. I have a background in cinematography and video editing. So that's kind of where I got my start. And then that progressed into like 2D motion design. And then, kind of found a passion for 3D. And that's the world I've been living in for the last couple of years.
Nice, man. Awesome. Yeah. So just to kind of go back to the origin of how you started all this, what got you into 3D motion design?
Yeah, well, I'd say like at the very beginning, I got my start in photography. So It was back in like 2016, maybe. I got my first DSLR. And so I just started shooting photos wherever I could. And that eventually turned into video. So doing video editing, shooting coverage, doing like little edits together, trying to make some like hype reels and stuff like that. And then I wanted to pursue video. And so after pursuing that, I got a part-time job at a church doing video work.
Oh, nice.
And that was like the door opening my eyes to the world of 3D and motion design, because the video director I worked with there was big. Like he used 3ds Max and I think Arnold at the time, but he would do these like crazy. I remember one of the series when I first started was this like Lego series. So he recreated Legos and animated this little like title package for the sermon series. And it was just like this crazy project that he did by himself. And I was like, this is something I can do. I had no idea. And so that first job was like what really, started learning about all of that, and then started learning about school motion and just diving into kind of the community. So that was like the big turning point of realizing that 3D was a thing that I could do for fun and for a job.
Wait, so you learned about that 3D stuff at a gig you had at a church?
Yeah.
That is the first that I've ever heard of that, which is super awesome. Damn, wow.
Yeah,
that's cool.
I would say, so I'm out in Michigan, and there's a couple like bigger churches. And so there was a big kick of having like big title packages and sermon series and having a couple of video people for the church as a whole.
Awesome. Okay, sweet, man. That's something new to hear, and that's really awesome.
Yeah.
Because I've heard of a couple people here and there. They did animations and motion graphics for churches, but that sounds like a much bigger production than I ever would have expected.
Yeah, I didn't realize like that was, I guess, a thing that you could do, but there's quite a few churches that I've noticed that you can do that. But yeah, that was the start. And I think the thing that I found enjoyment in that was I had a lot of creative freedom to explore. So later on in my career being at the church, I wanted to do 3D, and I could talk to my boss and be like, can I try to do this in Blender or Cinema and like make it work? I did one of them in Unreal Engine 5 because that came out and I just wanted to learn. They're like, yeah, go for it. So there was a lot of creative freedom there, which was helpful.
That's awesome. Damn, nice. Well, sounds like a great opportunity, man. So then, that's cool to hear about your background. So then kind of jumping ahead though, so what got you into freelancing then?
So I knew it was probably, I think it was like 2020 is when I first started getting into 3D. So the pandemic first hit, and I had messed around with like Element 3D a little bit and After Effects, trying to do some 3D projects. Tried opening Blender and learning it at one point before the pandemic, but like popped it open, was so confused, tried to tutorials and then shelved it, never tried again. And then COVID hit and I was like, okay, I'm stuck at home. This is the time to actually like learn 3D and go for it. And so I just did a bunch of tutorials, and that's, I guess, like was the big turning point of like wanting to do that more and more and more. And so I would try to incorporate it any way I could in the church job that I was working, doing video. But then I kind of learned like, okay, I could do freelance on the side. And so I knew that, I had done reels for video editing and my cinematography. And so I just started doing personal projects, stuff for fun, to be able to showcase like, hey, I can do 3D. If you want help with this, I can do that. And so I think it was 2021 and I had put my first reel together that had 3D incorporated in it. So it was like half 2D, half 3D. Shared it, reached out to someone on LinkedIn just to like they're, wanting to meet other creatives in the area. Reached out, we had a convo, and then like 2 weeks later, they wanted me to hop on a project. And so did my first freelance project. And so, yeah, the last couple years, I've actually done freelance part-time. So it was in the evening hours, I had the full-time job, keep doing that. And then it wasn't until July of last year is when I went freelance full-time.
Gotcha. Okay. So how's that been for you so far when you went full-time freelance?
It's been good. It's been quite busy, which has been good. I know there's, I feel like I've heard from the community, there's upticks of being slower. Things are picking up in certain areas. I think being in a smaller side of Michigan, being on the west side, there are some production companies out here, but there aren't a ton of production companies, and there's not as big of a market of 3D artists. And so I think that's been helpful to be one of the 3D artists in the area to help get. So that's, I think, kept me quite busy.
Nice. So did you find though, as far as the work though, have you been getting more work that with like local clients or remote stuff, or how's that balance been?
It's pretty much been all local. So there's, I'd say right now about 3 production companies in like a 100-mile radius that I've been working with. One of them a lot. But yeah, I mean, it's all been local. I've reached out to some stuff on the east side of the state, like in the Detroit area, and made some good connections over there. But it's all kind of been more on local to me.
Awesome. Dude, that's good to hear, man. Cause yeah, it's awesome to hear that you've been getting local clients, because it seems like, remote work is more prevalent these days.
Yeah.
And I know people sometimes move to those bigger hubs. Like I know I moved across the country to California to be closer to that. But yeah, the fact that you're finding local clients, especially with the uptake of remote work, is really cool.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those I'd love to do that, but I think it's cool to be able to sustain in like the local area and not have to rely on that. Cause I feel like I've been hearing that a lot of people are wanting to be back in person. And it's becoming more and more of being in person. And so being tucked away in a small city, it's nice that I've been able to find clients and do some cool work.
Nice, man. That's awesome. Sweet. So one question I wanted to ask you though. So you said that before you started sprinkling 3D into your work and now you're more focused on 3D. I mean, did you make a very conscious decision to be a 3D artist, or how did you transition to distinguish yourself as either kind of a 2D, 3D designer or specifically a 3D designer?
Yeah. So when I started freelancing, I had been doing 2D motion design for a couple of years before I picked up 3D. I mean, pretty much the start, I got like my first video job in 2018. And as soon as I started doing that, I had to start doing like 2D title packages. 3D was never a requirement, but it was like, hey, we want you to do 2D. So I did a lot of time learning After Effects and just diving into that. So I had been doing that for a bit. I loved that. I originally thought that I wanted to do 2D motion design. That was like what I wanted to do full time rather than, work towards that. But then when I found 3D, I just loved, I guess, the more technical side of that in the world of 3D. So when I started freelancing, I didn't promote that I did 2D at all. Like if someone asked, I might say that I did it. Some of the production companies, there was only really one that I worked with consistently, just since I did have a full-time job. If they had something, I might do it, but it was pretty much just like I only advertised 3D if I was trying to advertise that. And so I started, I guess, trying to build my online persona as a 3D artist. So I was just sharing a lot of 3D work. I wasn't really sharing 2D work. I eventually started different, Instagram for the work that I did, but was only promoting the 3D stuff. Had a portfolio that only included that. So it was really one of those, like, I guess, made that choice of like, this is what I enjoy doing. I would love to do this. I don't know how to do there, but I'll just start showcasing that work and hope that over time people pick up on that and I'll eventually be able to do that full time.
Gotcha. Okay. That's good to know, man. Yeah. Cause I know sometimes, people say that they have to basically customize their reel to pursue a specific kind of work. So that's good to know that was a very conscious decision on your part. Yeah, just curious about that. But speaking about your work though, I know you've been posting your stuff on LinkedIn, which has been awesome on your socials and all that. And I think today we have the honor of having some stuff that you're going to show us. So yeah, I guess I know for the folks who are listening on this audio, won't be able to see this, but This will be posted online and on YouTube and stuff. So you care to walk us through some of the work that you said you were going to show?
Yeah. So the project I'm going to walk through today is for a company called Bloom, which they're actually local to the big town that I live in, not even just like the general city. I live in a smaller city outside of that. And they are a planter company. So they have little pots and they have, plants in there. And one of their products that they had that they wanted to market was a self-watering planter. And so they wanted to be able to showcase that, you can pour it, the water stays in the bottom, and the roots just kind of suck up the water when it needs. And they were launching in a different store. And so they needed that part of their marketing. And so production company that I work with, Ozone Films, they reached out to them and wanted to see how they could help. And so, we started talking about that and figuring out how to do it. And then the director had a fun idea of making it a one take 360 animation. So I think that was one of the cool things within this project was, being able, there's a couple challenges like building out a living room scene to make it look photoreal. I had to build a camera rig that worked to be able to do a full 360 animation. There was a transition from a living room scene to just a full white cyc scene. So trying to build a scene of how do I have two different environments, but have it live in one scene and one camera animation. So there was a bit of compositing that I had to do. Very basic to get things to overlay and switch in that transition. So this is the final environment that we worked in. So it's a very basic blockout of just kind of a couple walls. There was no roof on the scene, and there really isn't anything in the room outside of what the camera perspective was. So kind of knowing beforehand what the animation was going to be, we kind of blocked out where the transitions would be. So we knew, okay, this is just the white cyc environment. We don't have to show anything past this. And so that was very helpful to kind of keep the world building to a minimum. But I mean, this was a fun scene for lighting. We have, a couple different area lights and gobo lights. So there's a sunlight in here, but that's really just adding to the ambient light in here. Okay. A lot of this was lit with area lights or gobo lights with some gobo textures on it to mimic like trees on the ground. And so, this is kind of the rundown of the scene. I can pull open. Let's see. So I kind of have a pure board of the project timeline. I originally got CAD from them. And so once I got the CAD, before we started building out an environment, we worked through just some kind of texture dev. So they had sent me a planter and I was able to look at that kind of in real life, see kind of what the texture would be, and then try to mimic that. And so, they had two color palettes, a black and a beige. And so we just kind of worked through quite a few different angles and renders to make sure everything looked correct and kind of dial in how much bump there was, the imperfections on there that maybe you could see in the bottom there. And at one point we did really have to dial in kind of the color palette of the beige. So start sending renders with hex codes on it to make sure which option looked good.
Oh, and those photos had to show the exact hex color on there?
Yeah. So we had a very specific hex code and we brought that hex code in, made sure it was matched, but it was not quite looking, I guess from my understanding, they were trying to pick a hex code that quite matched what they had, but they didn't actually have the actual hex code for what the color was. And so we kind of went back and forth to make sure that it looked how it was looking on their end for like the actual physical color. Cause I didn't have that in person. The color that I was sent, it was a different planter. Texture was similar, but it wasn't this. I don't think this was manufactured at the time. And so, we kind of played a little bit of a guessing game and just went back and forth to dial that in. And so that was kind of the first stage was walking through this, getting approval on that. And then once we had that done, we started going into the environment building. They had some other references that they had sent, but in the middle of the project, these were like the two biggest reference images that we had. And so they wanted a very clean, white, bright, kind of the airy, bright look. See a little bit of a couch, maybe a blanket, and then the planters and the table. So this was kind of the first render that we did for them. And this was more like internal working through. I don't know if we ended up ever sending this to the client, but wasn't too focused on dialing in textures, but just trying to block out the scene, the lighting, kind of the look like that. And that's kind of what all of these were. So had first round, tried a different angle to see if that would be kind of the look that we wanted. I tried some different ones and kind of worked through how warm it should be. And then at this point, when we started sending some of the stuff that was a bit warmer, was kind of when they mentioned they wanted more of a brighter look.
Sorry, just curious, like as you're showing these, so all these, like when you have the warmer looks, the cooler looks, are you doing this in post or actually in camera in the scene?
Yeah, no, that's good to mention. So all of these were brought into DaVinci Resolve, but I was color grading on top of my render. I feel like, I tend to always do some sort of grading in DaVinci. So there's some grain in there. And then, so there was kind of looks, but that was all done in DaVinci Resolve.
Gotcha. Okay. Good to know.
Yeah. Yep. And so then, we kind of worked through when we got this reference here. That was when we started kind of trying to dial in this look. And so went through a couple different lighting options, very small tweaks between these. But then this is kind of ultimately what we settled on was this look, which was awesome.
Damn, I will say though that looking at your reference, I mean, those references are photos, right? That were provided?
Yeah.
Okay. That's crazy and this is just a testament to your skill. Just the fact that the photo references, I mean, look identical to your 3D render. So considering that you can't even tell the difference between your render and a photo is compliments to you. So,
well, thank you very much. I feel like, and I feel like I've mentioned this when people ask, like, being that I had a background in cinematography and editing, I feel like that's really helped my eye for what the camera would pick up, perspective, different things like that. And so I've heard a lot of 3D artists talk about trying to think how they would shoot it if they were in a studio or something like that. And so my goal is just like, how would I light this if I was on set? If I had some aperture lights and I was trying to be the DP, what would I do? And so, it's fun to kind of dive into that. And so it was kind of texture dev, environment dev, and then we happened to go into some of the animation. And I could pop open a scene if you'd like.
Sure.
So these were good to work through, and these were fun. These were challenges, but it wasn't the big challenges I had in my mind were a couple different things. And the first one that we can dive into was the camera rig that I came up with. Very simple, but we had to have one take and it had to spin around the product. So we start at one point in the product, we shift over to another point, eventually making a full 360 around the product and then back to our wide shot. And so if there are any animators out there and they've tried to animate specifically around an object, that can be difficult. And so when I dove in first, I just tried brute forcing it, of setting a keyframe, going into the graph editor, trying to ease it. And it worked well until I got to needing to be on the back side of this. So if we're on the front of the sphere as our, test object, when I got to the back side, that was when I was having a hard time to keep the perspective, the rotation and all of that clean. And so one of the things I came up with is this little rig. So in Blender, if you go over to your object constraints, you can add a constraint so that it tracks to something. So it's kind of like the track to tag in Cinema. And so I have it set at this empty object. And so if I move this, the camera will pan with it, which makes it really nice. If I start moving, in the y-axis, you get that parallax. And so it made it so that I didn't have to necessarily worry about animating the rotation. All I had to worry about was animating the position, and the rotation would kind of correct itself. But I knew that I needed a little bit more control, because if you just set it to the object, it's going to block that dead center in the image every single time. And that's not necessarily what you want or need. You want to be able to, maybe position it on the left third of the frame or the right third of the frame, whatever that may be. And so that's kind of when I decided to put the empty object there. And so that made it a lot less painful and made it a little bit easier. It was still a lot in the graph editor and diving through that, but it was a fun challenge to work through.
Gotcha. I'm just curious. So this little rig that you created in the object that you're tracking with in Blender, is that similar to also like the target tag?
Yeah. So that's, exactly. You could do the same thing in Cinema. So if you put a target tag on the camera and then put a null object by whatever product you wanted to showcase, then you would essentially have the same rig as this. It's just named something different here in Blender.
Gotcha. Okay. Good to know.
Yeah.
Nice.
So
man.
this was one challenge that was overcome, and I can dive into the next one if you'd like.
Sure.
So the next, I guess, big thing for me in the project was halfway through the animation, we go a little bit wider, and then the product gets kind of cut in half to show the self-watering part of it, that there's water when you pour it in, it goes to the bottom of the reservoir and it stays there and it kind of hangs out there, and then it will just feed itself as it needs to. And so I had to figure out how to simulate that. And I did some tests in the beginning to do an actual like water sim. But for anyone that's done that, unless you're in Houdini, I feel like there's a lot less control, especially in Blender. The simulation, even if you get some add-ons like Flip Fluid, it's just very crazy. And especially working at real world scale, and this is a very small product, it was just, the water was throwing out through the sides. I could not get it to look good. And I was like, I needed to find a different way to come up with this. And so from what you see in the animation, it's actually multiple parts put together to simulate that. There is essentially like a Boolean object that's making the water move up. But one of the big things I needed to come up with was kind of like natural ripples. And there's a cool little tool in Blender called Dynamic Paint. And so this is a little test scene to kind of showcase that. And so if I take this object and say, this is what I want to be my water, I can head down. And if I make this a canvas, you can actually put it as waves. And so it naturally produces ripples and you can control different things within it. And then I set this sphere as a paintbrush. And so then if I hit play and then move the sphere, it animates little ripples in there. And so what I did was, where I had the water, it was filling up as it was rising, I knew where I wanted the water to be pouring in at. And so I just set the sphere right here where the water would be pouring in at. And I hit play and I turned it on auto keyframe. And I just went like this and did quite a few takes of these. And then it was like, all right, the water's done. And now all those keyframes are baked in. And so anytime I play it back, it just works. And so I can turn the sphere off, but the ripples continue in there. And if you turn this into like a glass liquid, you get some nice, even like refraction down in here. Like you can see the ripples coming into the bottom of the water, which, made a really convincing effect of these ripples in here.
Sick. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's crazy how quick the feedback is too when you're doing this.
Yeah, that's one big thing that I've been a big fan of is like I hop into projects sometimes for Cinema and Redshift, and I do enjoy them. I love them. There's things that they're way better at than Blender, but I am a big fan of the viewport on the IPR for Blender, of just how fast it snaps around and denoises, and makes it, when you're doing like specific texturing, makes it a lot easier, I feel like, to really dial in your textures.
Yeah, nice. Damn, that's awesome.
Yeah, man. Well, the second part of this was the water, and I have a separate scene for that, and I can show how we did that. So I had the bottom part of the water where the water is filling up, but then I needed to make the water flow out. And again, simulation, I thought maybe this would be the one part that I could simulate, and we'll see, and have like I know you can set an object to basically make the particles being emitted disappear, but simulation still wasn't working. And so I was like, well, in Blender, and I don't know if Cinema has this, but there's things called metaballs.
Yeah.
And so if you bring a metaball in, it starts trying to morph and basically surface with the nearest object. And so if they're in proximity, they kind of form a mesh. And so the idea was I would take an object, and so in this case, this test scene is a little sphere, and set that to be the emitter, and then have all of the particles follow a curve. And so if I hit play, I have the object being emitted from the emitter being these metaballs. So you can set the speed that they go out of, but then it flows like water does. And obviously this is a lower resolution. And so for the final, I dove into the particle settings. And if you crank up a number that it's being emitted, you get a lot more of a smoother look, and you can mess with the size of the metaballs, and that will take a little bit of dialing in to get to look more natural. But this is essentially the technique that I used. And one of the cool things too with this was, since it is a curve in Blender, if I made this in objects, now I have an empty parented to this curve. So when I hit play, I can take this and real time animate where the curve goes. And so I essentially had one at the bottom that was static where the water was. And in the canister that the water is pouring out of, I parented this emitter and then the end of this hook. And so in the animation, it's hard to tell from the wide frame, but there's actually subtle movement on the canister, like pouring. And so the curve is mimicking that, and it's moving left to right and kind of a little bit forward. And so it's not perfectly just falling. And so, yeah, this technique with the other one were completely separate from each other. They were just cleverly lined up, but never had anything to do with each other. Just made it look like it was.
Nice. That's awesome, man. Yeah, I would think that this is like great to see the behind the scenes on this, because I would think that everything was a full simulation, but it's really cool to see that you took the pieces and simulated each part to mesh it together to make it all seem like a live demo or a live simulation.
Yeah. Well, and it was one of the things I was like, okay, I need something that I can iterate on fast and something that can be very art directable. And you can definitely art direct simulations, but I guess that's not my strong suit.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing the limitations in Blender, I feel like it really is hard to art direct that a bit more. And so, yeah, I feel like as I dive into 3D more and more, it's just learning one technique that can combine into the next, and then in the next. And it's like, how do you take all these different things and work them together? And how could I tweak it for this scene or this project? And so this was kind of a culmination of learning a lot of different little techniques and making it look like one cohesive piece, which is really fun to kind of dive into.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, this is awesome, man. Hopefully this gives people ideas too, because I know, yeah, if you're new to 3D or unfamiliar with these tools and stuff, I guess this is a great way to kind of think differently, as opposed to thinking like everything has to be a simulation or has to be, real, so this is awesome.
Yeah. I feel like 3D, there's a lot of hacks to make things work together.
Right.
It's never as seamless as you think it is.
Gotcha. Did you by any chance have the final piece after everything was done?
Yeah. So I guess we can dive into, one of the parts I always kind of wondered, getting started in 3D was the back and forth of iterating in animations and not having to render everything out, especially for a project like this where it was, I think, 720 frames in total. So even at 1080 and low samples, like it just takes a long time to render.
Okay.
And so we did a lot of viewport renders back and forth. And so I can pull up, this was like initial test. This was actually the final test that we did for the piece. So had all the call outs in there, the water pouring in, and this was a great way to go back and forth and work through all the animation and figure out, time things in and not have to render anything out. So it made it a lot easier for me to work with the director and go back and forth. This one had kind of some of the room in there, but I'd say we probably did 10 to 15, if not more, of these, just going back and forth and working on specific transitions. By the first early text test that we did, because we ended up doing all the text in 3D as well. I just knew with set parallax in the shot that trying to comp that in After Effects or Fusion would be such a pain. And so
that was going to be my question. I was wondering if you did that text either in 3D or you did it in post.
Yeah, it was. So there's a spot in the final piece that I'll point out that I did do some comping in Fusion on some certain elements, like the very opening title card and the end.
Mm-hmm.
But any call outs that were to the planter were all done in 3D. Just, I knew that there was going to be such big shots and such parallaxing that it was going to be a massive pain. And I rendered everything with text in it in the final frame, and I probably should have separated it a little bit more. So it's still based off of the camera in 3D, but not rendered with everything else. So if I needed to tweak the text, then it wasn't a full render or full re-render of the scene. But for this one, we ended up doing it, with the text all in the scene. But use some geometry nodes to animate the text, and made it nice to just stick in there and not have to worry about it.
Nice.
So we can pull open the final spot.
Nice.
So we'll let it play.
Sweet. And I see where you said that you did the transition from the room into like the white slate background.
Yep, absolutely.
Nice.
Yeah, and I tried paying attention, like if you can see like the bokeh, the like little imperfections within the bokeh kernels, changing the aspect ratio a bit too. So there was some, I guess, attention to that as well that we paid attention to. But yeah, so this opening text over here was actually done in Fusion. So I just did a planar track to the wall and then animated that then on, and then the same with the end text. Those are all done just in Fusion.
Nice. So just curious, so how come it is that you chose to do this in Fusion as opposed to like After Effects?
With doing all my color grading in Fusion or in DaVinci Resolve and any editing, I was in there. And so I have done Fusion for comping in the past, and I really like its planar tracker. Blender or not, After Effects has some great stuff, but I find that the tracking in Fusion just works really, really well. And as much as I love After Effects, I can find that it be a pain sometimes. So I was like, oh, I have to be in After Effects. I am not going to be. And it worked out well just being in that ecosystem to begin with.
Nice. Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah, because I rendered this, it's one take animation, but I had 6 different, I think 6, maybe 5 or 6 different render passes that were put together in different sequences to make it all work well. So I guess I could walk through that.
Sure.
We rendered out the first like 100 frames within this living room scene. And then the next transition is when we go to the white psych environment. So this was a separate render and then just comped the 2 different ones in there. And then this is one render still. And then right about here, right when this transition starts, I'd stop the render and turn on the Boolean objects, because in order for this half to kind of disappear and get taken away, it was very taxing on the scene. Even if it wasn't moving, it made everything render so much slower. And there was really no way to turn it off and have it not affect it without just having it completely off. And so, yeah, I'd stop it here and turn those effects on so that I could get this section going. And then as soon as it was closed, I stopped the render and then turned all those effects off so that my render times weren't as horrendous. And I could work through it again. And then, yeah, so then this was one whole section that was rendered. And then when we get to the transition here, that's where we kind of cut. And we had planned this out originally that we would have this leaf in place and the camera would pass by it, and that would be our transition point. And so I think I blended the frames like 2 or 3 frames. There was a crossfade, but since that leaf was there in there at both and it's the same camera move, it was a pretty seamless transition.
Nice.
And then it kicks over to this last render pass.
Sweet. Damn, that came out great.
Thanks, man. Yeah, it was a fun one. It was a lot of like different combination of techniques, learning a lot of different techniques for myself. And then, yeah, I guess getting to put to test of like lifestyle, photoreal living room environments, which was really fun to play around in.
Yeah, totally. So just curious on this project though, what were kind of the timelines for each of the milestones? Like when you first did like the initial explorations and then like the viewport renders and then modeling animation. I mean, what was like kind of the timelines for each bucket?
Yeah. So the project, I don't know if specifically on like we had this and then this, but I know in total, we started this project, I think it was the 1st of August, we kicked this off. And then we had to have everything delivered officially by, it was like September 15th or something like that. I think we had to have the rough renders we did a week before the final was due and make any last tweaks. And so from conception to delivery was, I think about a month and a half that we had to do this.
Okay. Gotcha. That's good to know. Is that pretty typical for most 3D projects? Is that shorter or longer? Or what's that look like?
I would say it's decently typical. It depends. Like I just got done doing some stills, did 5 still images for a company, but I had 6 weeks to do the still images. Whereas this, I would say I'm pretty typical in the month to 2 month range working on them. There's some that I've had that they need it quick. And then so I've had some like 2-week turnarounds from conception to end. And those have been some crazy projects, but somewhere in here, I feel like is a healthy range of time.
Gotcha. Okay. That's good to know. Because I feel like a lot of times, especially with 3D, depending on how complicated it is, how long renders take, clients might not understand how much of a lift it might be. And so it's always good to get perspective on that to see, realistically, what are the timelines for 3D projects?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that was part of the reason that we went with the white psych was I wasn't sure how long it might take to build out more in the environment and how much we might have blocked out. And I knew that there was going to be different tasks that were going to be a little bit trickier to figure out, like the animation of the camera and then the simulation of the water. And so that was part of the reason it went to white cyc, was just saving time on having to build up more of the environment and dial those different looks in. That made it a lot easier. So that was kind of a timeline choice with the timeline as well.
Nice. All right, that's good to know. Yeah, it's a smart decision too. Yeah, because that's one thing I didn't consider. If you were going to be rotating and the camera moved, you would have to show other elements. So I think the white cyc was, a great solution for that.
Yeah, that was one of the things that came to us. And we had talked about doing some live action VFX and ultimately came up with this concept that, we figured we could hit with deadlines. And we blocked it out trying to make it as smooth as possible. And so that's kind of why we chunked out the project the way we did. That we, the first thing was making sure the texture of the planter, the product that we want to showcase, looks great. Then we build out the environment so that we get kind of our hero shots locked in. Like, we know this is the widest the camera's going to be. This is going to be the main thing that you see. That looks great. And then really after that, it was just dialing in the animation. And we did have some kind of storyboards. So the director and I sat down, we took some areas of stills where he wanted to have the callouts be, and then we sent those over to them. They looked at the very rough renders and the text that we'd have populated on the scene, and then kind of proved that. And so then that gave us, we have to go in the texture, go in the environment. We're greenlit for the storyboard. Now we can just execute on the animation. And so by the time we got to the first 1080p render, there was really no surprises for them. They had seen pretty much everything and was trying to make it so that there wasn't this big, we have no idea that this is what it was going to turn out. Because this was the first time that they had worked on a 3D project. And so I feel like it made it, really seamless. And it was kind of how we try to do a lot of projects now, is break it down that way to make sure everything's as smooth as possible.
Well, man, that was awesome. That project came out really cool. So thanks for sharing that, and appreciate the walkthrough.
Absolutely. I'm always happy to nerd out about 3D and show some behind the scenes.
Oh yeah, for sure. So then after, kind of learning about your background and walking through some of the projects, it's really helpful to see. What do you think is your plans for, career, freelance? Like, what do you think you have planned for the future?
Yeah, it's so tricky. I feel like there's multiple things that I'd like to do. I think the biggest thing for right now, making the transition to freelance was a bit scary for me. Mm-hmm. I have a wife, I have a daughter, and having those responsibilities made it a lot trickier, and I guess made me a lot more nervous jumping into the transition of doing full-time freelance. And so the beginning part was just surviving and making it through things. But I feel like I've gotten some good, feet going, some good ground coverage, and have really, kind of put my name out there, which has been great. And so now it's kind of like that next stage of what type of projects, or who do I maybe want to work on projects with? It would be cool to work with bigger companies, but I think just finding cool people to do projects with is something that excites me. Is, do I enjoy working on projects with you and we having a good time, whether it's planters or whatever it may be? I'm just excited to work on it with some cool people. So I'd say that could be a thing. And then, just diving into more projects with other 3D artists, I think would be fun. A lot of these projects are just myself, the only 3D artist, working with the director, which is awesome. But I think it'd be really cool to dive into more projects with a team of 3D artists and really learn from other artists how they tackle things, how their brain works on, coming up with solutions for 3D.
Nice. Yeah, I could definitely resonate with that. I love the collaboration aspect. I think that's one great thing about our industry, is that usually everyone is really enthusiastic and sharing information, which is awesome. But I guess I was just curious too, is there any kind of specific industries or products or anything that you'd ideally like to work with or pursue?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I get drawn to technology or different higher end products. So any tech driven products. I've seen some cool stuff for robotic arms that are done in 3D. They're showcasing different things. So I feel like being able to combine a very cinematic, moody look, looking at some of the stuff that Future Deluxe or Tendril does.
Oh yeah.
I think is very classy, very design focused, and beautiful frames, a I'm trying to think who it was too. There was another company that did stuff for Logitech, and it's very well thought out design style frames for some cool products. And so I think something in that realm would be really cool to dive into.
Nice. Awesome. Well, wouldn't be surprised if we see you working on that sometime soon. So,
well, maybe I'm open.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, just this would be great. So myself and everyone else can follow you and keep up with you. So where can people find you and get in touch with you?
Yeah. So if you want to see my website, you can go to ntfvisuals.co. And that's my website. NTF Visuals is my handle on Instagram.
Okay.
And then Nathanael Fairbotham on LinkedIn would be the other place to find me. So those three I'll be active on.
Nice. Yeah. And I'll be sure to link those in the show notes. But yeah, just curious where you're active so people can kind of keep an eye on and do some stalking.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, dude, this has been awesome, man. So I really appreciate you taking time to walk us through everything. So yeah, I know a lot of people get a ton of value out of this. So I really appreciate you arranging all this and making the time for us. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, hopefully some of my words made sense, and just happy to chat about it. And yeah, anyone sees it and has questions, like feel free to reach out, and love to chat and talk more about 3D. Just love doing it.
Awesome. Well, sounds good. Yeah. Well, I guess we'll catch up with you soon then.
Awesome. Thanks, Christian.
Really awesome to connect with Nate and see his project breakdown. Aside from seeing Nate walk us through his project in Blender, this chat was really great since we learned how Nate found his way into 3D by having the freedom and flexibility when he was staff as an artist at his local church. It's also really cool to hear how Nate's work was primarily through local businesses, which is awesome to hear in the days of remote work being more common. Be sure to follow Nate and his socials, which I'll link in the description. But thanks again, and we'll see you in the next chat.